Today, I'm thrilled to have my friend Darin Reed, a seasoned movie post production supervisor and associate producer, joining us on the show. Darin brings a wealth of experience and practical advice for aspiring filmmakers looking to make their mark in the dynamic world of Hollywood. We dive into Darin's unique upbringing and how his approach to filmmaking paved the way for years of success. Throughout the episode, you'll be treated to insightful and entertaining stories that showcase his comprehensive understanding of the filmmaking process. And if that's not enough, Darin's a strong advocate for mentorship, embodying one of the nicest personalities you'll encounter in the industry. So stick around for a conversation that's not just informative, but also a glimpse into the genuine and approachable side of a Hollywood insider. All right. Hey, Darin, thank you so much for taking the time out of your day to join me on the podcast today.
Oh, thank you so much for having me.
Yeah, we've known each other for quite a while since our days at the production studio, and it's been obviously a long time that we've both been out here. And I think that your story, your background to me has always been interesting. And for me on this podcast, I always dive right in from the beginning, right? And you have this unique family influences, you've had these with Native American artifacts, going into filmmaking in your early years. Like how did these like experiences with your family and your upbringing in the Arizona area sort of shape like your interest in Hollywood and inspires you sort of pursue the career that you have today?
My grandmother Cross, my mother's mother, when she was, I think, 3 or 5, her mom, my great-grandfather was an alcoholic. So my great-grandmother had to move the family from Pennsylvania to Arizona. And I'm not sure why they chose Arizona. It might have been for health reasons. There was a lot of people back then had emphysema and such. But regardless, they settled in a place called Mud Springs, which was literally a mud springs that later became a spa. But they settled there. It was the middle of the desert. My grandmother and her siblings had to hunt rattlesnakes to eat. And so the reason I'm telling you all this is she was an incredible storyteller. And I sort of, when I think back about her, I think that they lived in the middle of the desert. They weren't in a town or a city. I think they had to sort of create an imaginative world for themselves to keep themselves entertained as kids. And when I was little, she told some really tall tales about Arizona legends. We have a legend about the Mogollon monster, which is like this sort of Bigfoot creature I think it's up in the White Mountains. When I was a kid, she had an old beat up pickup that never ran while I was alive. It just sat in her backyard and there was like a mark on it. And as a kid, I asked her, Grandma, what's that mark? And she told me this incredible story about how she and my grandfather, when he was alive, were sleeping in the back of the pickup and the Mogollon monster attacked, and for years and left the mark on the pickup. And for years, I believed that story until I grew out of it. But that's the kind of environment that I grew up in, storytelling. And then there was a show in Phoenix that used to run on Saturday mornings at 10:30 called World Beyond. And it showed monster movies and science fiction movies. And all of us kids in Phoenix was a much smaller city when I grew up there than it's become. It's a huge megalopolis now, but it was a much smaller city. And so all of the kids at school would tune into World Beyond. And we were sort of raised on old monster movies and Godzilla films and those things. And I think it really sparked my interest. I like to tell stories. I used to draw comic books. When I got my dad bought me a Super 8mm camera because, there was no digital or even video back then. And so I took a $6 million man action figure and I did stop motion where I animated it so it looked like he was walking around. I mean, I like manipulating in a positive way an audience's emotion to entertain them, if that makes sense.
Mm-hmm.
When I did my first short film, and I don't want to jump ahead, but when at a USC Universal program, when the audience, it was a suspense thing, and sitting there watching the audience like lean forward and get, so, it was just like it was like a drug. It was like a high. I was like, oh, it's incredible that we can create something that can move an audience in this way. So that's the kind of background I grew up in. And also I was a asthmatic and a nerd, really awkward, painfully shy, terrible at sports, like I was the last guy in class to be chosen for the teams. Every PE session was humiliating for me because I was the last guy. Like they would pick anybody before me. And so I kind of preferred in some ways the fantasy worlds were more pleasant to me than being the school dork, which I definitely was.
Yeah, no, I think we've all been there with dodgeball and you name all these PE activities that you're like, oh my gosh. Sometimes you don't want to get picked, but they have to put you somewhere eventually, I guess, right?
Yeah.
You shot this documentary though, right? So you had a history degree thesis, right? And you shot a documentary instead of writing a paper. So like that experience specifically, how was that like the beginning, or do you think it's like the $6 million man shooting with the 8mm? Like, how did that thesis stand out, and how that would shape the beginning of your filmmaking journey?
Well, what actually started to shape it was my dad. When I told him what I wanted to do, Phoenix had no film industry when I was there. Like you had 3 TV networks, the big 3, and a local TV station, and every once in a while they would shoot a local commercial. So my dad found out they were shooting a commercial for some Safeway or a supermarket. So it was a Saturday. I was very young, like, I don't know, maybe 10 or something. He took me to the location where they were shooting, and he told these grizzled old grips, this is my son. He wants to get in the film industry. I'm going to give him to you for a day. And he had bought me these gloves, work gloves. And he said, when I pick him up at the end of the day, I want these gloves to be dirty. I want you to put them to work. So these guys laughed, and then they put me in the meat locker where they had all these cables running, and I had to wrap cable all day, these huge cables that were, I couldn't get both hands around. And so that was like my first job in the film industry. And then I had some sporadic work, but in college, before the thesis, I would actually fly out to LA on weekends when I could, and I would work on some really reprehensible projects that I would be embarrassed to tell you about just to get the experience. The first jobs were free, and then they would like throw me like $50 and stuff. And so I started to learn somewhat about the industry. And then when it came time to do my thesis, because I love history, I was a history major. I gotta be honest with you, I'm thinking I was more motivated by not wanting to write a massive thesis paper than, but I truly can't remember, but there may have been actual enthusiasm to shoot a documentary. But I remember just thinking like, oh my God, like, because, a thesis paper is, but I do think, I know my original plan was I wanted to take a camera and drive Route 66 from start to finish and do a documentary on it. But my professor, who was just this amazing, venerable, history professor at Arizona State, he talked me out of it, I think now, because he was afraid I'd end up getting killed on the road or something and the school would be held liable. So he said, I'll sign off on this, but can you do something local? I came up with, I'll do a documentary about the sort of changing landscape of Arizona State University from when it was founded in the late 1800s or early 1900s until today. And so, I went out and shot that for my thesis, and it was a great experience. And it got me out of writing a research paper.
That's smart. I mean, it's innovative, right? You and I have very similar backgrounds, because my mother, I remember, I grew up Jersey Shore, Atlantic City, right next to it. She'd see something going on, something filming. She'd call me like, oh, get down there and, find out who you can talk to, get a job. And I think those indie productions were, And actually, my dad and stepmom did the same thing. I remember there was something shooting out where they lived offshore, and they contacted whoever, get down there, you can just help them out. And sort of those indie films, those experiences when you're a PA, there's no union. Not that unions are bad, of course. It just, when you're looking for experience when you're 18, sometimes these indie films, I mean, I was, boom operating. I was, doing things that you could not do on a regular production. So I think that was definitely helped shape my, the experience I brought to LA with me. Was born out of New York and Jersey and Philadelphia, but all indie films. So I think that something that we share in common.
And did you come to LA specifically to work in the film industry?
Yeah. So when I graduated college, it was like, okay, I'm gonna come out and I'm gonna give it 6 months, and I found a 6-month lease on an apartment in Hollywood. But when I came out, it was sort of like you. It was a lot of deferred payment. So you'd see these indie films and they'd say, oh, yeah, if this thing gets made, if this thing gets distribution, whatever, then we're going to pay you. I probably did 2 or 3 of them. And one actually did pay me a couple months later, which was bizarre because I didn't expect it at all. Yeah, they did eventually pay me, but essentially it was PA. And then I got a job on more of a substantial one that led me to New Line. I was doing these productions and it's like, wait a minute, they have an opening at the front desk, and I was kind of getting tired of being unemployed every 3 months, so that's how it led me to there. But yeah, that's what I initially came out for, trying to get in there. But again, the experience I got, in Jersey and on these indie productions definitely gave me a better idea of what I was getting into coming out here and how a set works. And obviously it wasn't as extravagant or lavish as the Hollywood stuff, but sort of like that gritty New York style, which were actually popular at the time, right? People were, kind of reverting back to that indie feel, even if they had a budget. But yeah, that is what brought me out here, much like yourself. And I think that those experiences on there, you just can't replace them, because it's very cool to meet people who are motivated and driven, but they're nowhere near Hollywood. At the time, it was like you could only come to Hollywood. Obviously now a lot of people can go to Atlanta probably and get the same, upbringing. But, it led me to this.
The thing that interests me about your journey is that you went from kind of that indie world and then did a huge leap to New Line. That's like a huge leap from that world to, when the studio was working on the Lord of the Rings trilogy, that was like ground zero in our day.
Yes. Yeah, exactly. And it basically, I think my time was around the movie Blow with Johnny Depp.
Oh, yeah. Mm-hmm.
And I was a PA on that one. So that's what I was like, okay, this is like my third or fourth major production, but I'm unemployed again, and you could sort of jump in with like a first AD. And, I felt like the first ADs I met were great people, but like, okay, now this lady is going to go off and direct a movie in, I don't know, Florida for the summer, and she's not bringing me. I'm a PA, right? So I'm like waiting around for her to get back. It just became hard, when you're 21, trying to like, okay, how do I pay my bills and also get experience, which was the whole point of it, right? The more people you meet, the more shows you work on. But then when the opening popped up at New Line, I was like, okay, this at least I can work in get to know this side of things, because I feel like I wasn't an expert on set production, but I felt like I knew it because I had done it for a good 5 years, between the indie stuff back home and then coming out here. I had enough to where, at least as a PA, I knew what I was doing, So let's see how this production office side, or, studio office side, whatever you want to call it, production company office works. And that was cool. And you mentioned like bigger productions like Lord of the Rings, right? And you were in post at the time, but now you've obviously grown into post-production supervising, you're associate producing on these sort of massive, productions. Like, for someone listening who doesn't even know what those roles are, could you give us like a glimpse into like a day in the life on the job in those roles?
Yeah. So what a post supervisor does basically is it's a complicated position. You're hired by the studio, and you're hired to manage the production during post. And what that means is keeping the production on track, keeping on budget, keeping on schedule, all of those things, managing the day-to-day problems. For those of us who work freelance, we're embedded within the crew, which is awesome. It's the best experience to be actually at the editorial office and working with all your teammates. And so, it's a managerial position. We set the schedules, and the schedules constantly change, as we know. Every time I send the crew the first schedule, I tell them, of course, this is going to change. It's just a target, because every film is different, and it's just rare that you have a schedule that's going to hold, because you do reshoots and different things like that. But anyways, we keep the film on schedule. We create new schedules every time there's a change. We're given the budget that the studio creates, and then we have to make sure that we don't go over budget. So he has to constantly track every expense. We approve every expense. We set up the cutting rooms. We're really sort of the go-to for all the filmmakers and the studio, the intermediary between the studio and the filmmakers. It's there's a lot of politics involved, because with every production there's going to be just politics between sometimes the filmmaker's vision differs from the studio's vision and such. So it's kind of a complicated. It's very pleasant. I love my job, but I warn people who are interested in doing what I do. I'm like, there can be stressful and unpleasant moments. Sometimes you have to go to the filmmakers and tell them things that they don't want to hear, because of some limitation you might have with the budget or time or such, And sometimes you have to go back to the studio and tell them unpleasant things that you don't want to hear. I'm like, here's where we are, but it's sort of a managerial role. I kind of think of it as a post-producer role. The producers are always involved when we get to post-production. And I've been blessed to work with some really great producers like Bo Flynn and Rob Cowan and just some incredible producers, Peter Safran, and they're all hands-on, and you also interface with them, and you have to sort of tell them on a day-to-day basis how the show is going and what's going on and stuff. But I kind of think of our role as being a post-producer. We're the go-to and the end-all, of what's going on in the post process. We have to make sure that the film is delivered on time, which is the most stressful aspect. Sometimes, you'll have a delivery date that you have to hit, which is usually about a month before a film is released. You have to have the film delivered by then. And sometimes, because of reshoots or delays or strikes or late visual effects, you're real close to blowing that date, but you got to make sure that doesn't happen. And I've never missed a date. I've never gone over budget. Knock on wood,
Yeah. That led sort of like to my next question is like, it sounds like when you do sort of, run into these, whether it's budgetary, you have to talk to the producers or tell the studio the bad news. Is there like, so are you turning on like a psychologist hat, or what's sort of like the way you navigate? Is that the most stress when you have to talk to a studio or to talk to the producers? That maybe it depends who the producer is. How do you navigate like the most stressful parts of the job?
That's a great question. I think that my personality might see when I first started doing all this, because I'd worked production for a huge portion of my career, and I got into post later because I always liked editing, and I liked how everything came together in post-production, because as you know, when we're in post, it's not just cutting the film or delivering the film. It's the music, the score, the visual effects, the titles, the credits, everything sort of comes together. So I got into it at a little bit later point than you did. I was older when I got my first break in post-production and worked at New Line and stuff. My point was, if you told me back then that I was going to do this job, I would say I'm the least equipped guy to do this, because I'm not like a heavy confrontational guy. I'm not like a mean guy. There are some post people who I've heard about at facilities and stuff who are just like tough as nails people, and I'm not that guy. I'm affable, but I think that the affability maybe and the trust has helped me when it comes to those stressful talks that you have to have, because I do believe I give it my all for the studio because I'm very loyal to them, because I still work primarily freelance for New Line, so there's 25 years of loyalty there, and they deserve it, because they're such a great group of people and a great studio. But I'm equally loyal to the filmmakers I work with, and I think they know that I have their best interest at heart. So I really think after, there's always a breaking in period, where the filmmakers are like, a lot of them have had difficult situations with other studios. So there's a little bit, you have to earn their trust, and once you do, I think they know that I have their best interest at heart. So I think that is the way I approach that. I was just thinking about it when you asked me that. I have one of my proteges. She was my post coordinator on Rampage. She's a big studio exec at Amazon. all of my proteges go on to, and I'm like, yeah. I'm still doing the same job. And I'm always like, I'm going to work for them someday, and I will.
Yeah.
But anyways, we had something we had to go and deal with. And I said, okay, let's go deal with it. And we're walking down the hall, and she goes, well, how are you going to deal with this? And I said, I don't know. I'm going to think it up on the spot. And whatever I came up with, I just improvised on the spot of so I think that improvisation is good too when you're dealing with, unpleasant circumstances or stressful conversations, or, But I love the people I work with on the studio side and the filmmaker side. And I've been really blessed, truly blessed for 25 years to work with some of the greatest filmmakers and the greatest people at the studio. And so that is 3/4 of the battle. When you deal with really great people like that, professionals and highly creative and talented, it makes it easier, somewhat easier.
Yeah. So it sounds like, maybe not having as much of an aggressive approach and being likable, but also being able to improvise are some traits that you have that help you sort of, keep your career going to the level that it's at. Right. And obviously having that's pretty cool that, you have proteges that have gone on to, just another testament to your work ethic and, what your value is to, the profession, I would say, and on top of that, you also are a filmmaker, right? So we mentioned, you mentioned a short earlier, Up Under the Roof. So that sort of received claim for a unique take on the classic ghost stories, I should say. In that world, right? When you're filmmaking, you're the filmmaker. What can you sort of dive into what drove you to adapt classic stories and how, blending traditional themes with your own unique perspective and experience sort of worked itself out into your productions?
Yeah, I think that what drew me to Up Under the Roof, I like the horror genre because it's a really creative genre where you can do a lot of really creative things. It has a reputation for being, just violent or visceral or whatever. But I think that a lot of filmmakers have done really interesting things with Peter Weir, Picnic at Hanging Rock. That is considered a horror film if you've ever seen it, and if you hadn't, I would recommend watching it because it's such a different, mysterious and interesting and beautiful way to tell a story, and so I like that genre a lot. And so I would read up, short horror stories and things like that. And I had heard about this acclaimed, very short, I can't remember, it might have only been 2 or 3 or 4 page story called Up Under the Roof by this brilliant author named Manly Wade Wellman, who was like a turn of the century, explorer and author and just a really adventurous guy. And so he was retelling this story about when he was a child. There was he kept hearing these noises at night in the ceiling right above his bed, and it was up in his attic, and it happened over a period, I think it was over a summer, and this was around the turn of the century. And so finally one day it was raining, and he felt this presence, so to speak, right above his bed, you know, in right above the ceiling over his bed. And he decided, if I don't go up and face it now, it's going to come for me. So he went up into the attic, and there was nothing up there. But what he says in the story is that was like the defining moment. And he actually believed that there was some sort of malevolent thing up there, and that because he had the courage to go up and face it, it vanished. And you know, his story ends with, he never felt fear again, even when he was in, I think it was World War I or World War II. He never felt fear again because of that moment. So that's my long way of saying I had heard about this story, I read it, and because, you know, I've had a lot of fear in my life and anxiety, I was very drawn to the story of a pre-teenage boy facing his fears like that. When I was that character's age, I used to have terrible fears of supernatural things at life, and I didn't have to go up and face anything. I just kind of grew out of it. But I used to watch horror movies in the morning. When it was time to go to bed, I'd lay awake at night, like terrified that something was going to come and get me. So I was drawn to that story. And then my take on it was, you know, I wanted to tell a more beautiful, visual, interesting interpretation of that story. And so Danielle Stallings, you know, my creative partner, she and I added a lot of characters into it. You know, we add different characters into it in different scenarios, whilst hopefully keeping, you know, the overall framework and the integrity of Mr. Wellman's story. I was really, really cognizant of that. I wanted to be loyal to his life story and stuff. And so that was kind of the approach that we took. And then, you know, with any short film, you know, it's time and money, just as it is with the big budget films that you and I have worked on. It's all about time and money. And so I went in with these lofty shot lists of like 15 shots, and we're going to do this setup, you know. And day one, the AD, God bless her, came over to me and was like, you know, this isn't going to happen. Like, she took out a pen and started crossing out shots and handed it back to me. That's what you're going to get. And so we sort of had to, you know, adapt on the moment. I had to adapt. And I you know, I was blessed to have the best crew, the best DP, Megan Schoenbachler. She's just phenomenal DP who comes from the photography world. And she was really able to capture that visual quality I was looking for. We were flashing frames of the camera, exposing frames as they went through the camera to achieve I can't remember what the percentage she did was. It was like 10% or something to create this kind of look that I was looking for, this kind of, you know, a little bit older, slightly diffused look. And she just did a stunning job. And I had Danielle producing. In fact, this was before, you know, the current much needed push to make the film industry more diverse. But looking back on it, I look back and I go, all of the department heads on Up Under the Roof were female. Like every single one of them, production designer, DP, producer, AD. It was a very female driven, you know. And then there was me fumbling around, and they all, as women do for men, they all kept me on track, you know, and God bless them. The interesting thing about all this, and going into the short, I knew we're not going to show an actual, you know, monster. It would be ridiculous. I knew that to keep the integrity of the story, the house was the monster, so to speak. You know, we didn't have any sort of ridiculous creature. It wasn't a ghost story. It was really about a young boy facing his fears in the 1920s. And, you know, unfortunately, we had set the film in the Dust Bowl in the 1920s. So I needed the perfect house. So I went through an exhaustive search to get the perfect exterior, which we found this old Victorian house down in Paris, California. It's somewhere south, I think. South or east. Yeah. It's a small town. We found this incredible exterior, and this extraordinarily kind woman let us shoot outside for a day. And then I searched exhaustively throughout LA for the right Victorian interior, because having to shoot on a set would have cost, you know, $100,000 or something to build the sets we needed. So long story short, you know, it goes to show that when you I always tell young people and proteges and just anybody entertaining a creative project, if you start, with good intentions and just put your intentions out there, your will to make it happen, you'll see how the universe and people respond. Danielle, who is one of the producers on the project, told me, why don't you call a real estate woman and see if they know of anyone? And I'm like, that's a genius idea. So I did, and I called a bunch. I didn't think anybody would respond because there was nothing to gain for them. And this incredibly kind woman called and said, I've got your location. It's this Victorian house that's a living museum down in Long Beach. We ended up negotiating with them, and they allowed us to go in for 5 days and shoot in this incredible Victorian house that had all of the original furniture in it. The same family had owned it for 100 years. And the funny part about the whole thing, because our story had a sort of overarching supernatural theme, is one of the guys that was part of this living trust, this living heritage group that managed the house, he told me, he goes, well, I got to tell you something. The house has a history of being haunted because the owner of the house, Mrs. Bembridge, bless her heart, when she was like in her 80s or 90s, she was murdered in the backyard by a handyman that she was trying to help. I think he stabbed her to death. And he goes, but I don't want you to tell anybody because, we take this seriously. It's a living museum, and we don't want this reputation to get out because locals will come and throw bricks try to break the windows at night. So they put up this cardboard cutout of a woman to make it look like there was
oh my, wow.
goes through the window. So I'm like, you don't have to worry about me. Mum's the word. So first day of shooting, crew gets on location. And the first thing the guy does is he starts telling, oh, you're shooting in a haunted house. And I'm like, oh no, because we film people, as I'm sure you may know, because you're one of us, there's a lot of superstition and, there's just a lot of we're more eccentrics, shall we say. And so what I noticed, we had the hardest working crew and they were amazing. But as it got dark, I started to notice people would filter out of the house. And by dusk, I was there by myself. I was nobody wanted to be in the house after dark. And, thankfully, because we were shooting with minor, we had to shoot limited hours anyways. But it became really comical for me because by 6 o'clock, I'm in this huge house by myself. And I'm not necessarily superstitious or afraid of ghosts, but one cannot, I had to stay with the equipment because if we'd been robbed, it would have been, if the equipment had gotten stolen, it would have been a huge catastrophe. So I'm in this huge house by myself watching the equipment every night. And, you couldn't help but wonder, I would sleep down in the parlor. I'm not sleeping up in those bedrooms upstairs. And at certain times of the night, you'd hear creaking and stuff. It was just the house settling, but I'd be looking around And one night I just said out to the universe, I'm like, Mrs. Bembridge, if you can hear me, just please bless our production, and I think she did because we had a lot of success. It was a huge undertaking and everybody gave it their all. And, our film did really well on the film circuit in film festivals. And to this day, all these years later, we have a site, an Up Under the Roof site that I just keep going out of sentiment, but I'll get emails from people saying, oh, I'd really like to see your film. And then I'll send it off to them via Vimeo and we get good feedback and stuff. And I get emails from all around the world still. So Mrs. Ben
awesome
with us. Yeah. And again, I'll tell younger people, it's not that I like to talk about myself or the film, I don't, but it's that I try to tell them, you see how life just comes together. Not only were we able to get everything we needed to make this film, but we got to shoot in a supposed haunted house, which was a great story. And when I was on the festival circuit, I would always tell this story. And it was always, the audience always gave us the biggest reaction of anybody standing up there, for short films is they were just riveted when I told them the ghost story. So it became a sort of calling card for the film. So it all worked out. And it was a great experience that I look back on really fondly.
Yeah, sounds like Mrs. Bembridge. Should probably give her an associate producer credit or something. Putting all
I
putting
should
all that
have.
together.
I should
So,
have.
but going into the film festival, right? So what do you do? Like, so you're a filmmaker. You get this film, you're done. What's the process? And I'm sure things may change now with uploads versus maybe you were mailing in things in the past. But how do you start for someone listening? I have a short. I want to get into festivals. What's the process you took?
Well, it's a different world now than it was then. Back then there was it was called Without a Box, and that was the name of the website. And you would have to apply online, and then you would send a DVD out to the different festivals, and then they would review them all and get back to you. And I could talk forever about film festivals because there used to be a sort of, I spoke with a film festival coordinator who had started I think the LA Film Festival. He was one of the founders. And he told me there's a perfect time you want to send your film to the festivals. And it's not right at the start, because all the people who are looking are always like, we're not going to take the first batch that seriously because we're going to get so many more, and there's going to be something really great out there. And you don't want to get in the last batch because they're burned out at that point. Like, they're burned out of watching short films or features. You want to hit them right in the center. And so I would tell people who are applying to film festivals to sort of use that rule, no matter, if you're applying online or not. But back then it was a physical process. Today I'm thinking it's a much easier, more streamlined online process. But you really do. You want to hit them. Years ago, in preparation to do Up Under the Roof, I screened short films for the American Film Institute. I was one of their judges, and that was a great experience for me because I was able to understand what you go through, because it's exactly what I said. You get films, and at first it's exciting, and you're kind of like, oh, this film's good. And then you start to think like, well, what if I get 100 of these? How am I going to choose? And then in the middle is probably when you're at your peak. And then by the end, you've seen so many films, good and bad, that you're just burned out. And you're like, oh my God, I can't look at any more of these, but I'll sit through the rest of them. So I would say try to hit that you want to try to hit in the center of, the whatever you call that period, the period where you're submitting the film. You want to kind of, like, if it's a 3-month submission period, you want to kind of hit there right in the center if you can. And then you want to get festivals that suit your film. Now, again, I can't speak about today's festival world, but in the old festival world, there were like 20 festivals where you're like, if you can get your film in one of these festivals, you're gold. What festivals want is, at least in the old days, they want to premiere your film, your short or your feature, because they want to be able to say, Up Under the Roof premiered at our festival. It's calling card for them. So what you don't want to do is premiere your short at, some unknown festival or a small festival, and then send it to Sundance, and Sundance will be like, well, is this shown anywhere? Well, yeah, actually, our first public showing was at Sundance. It's like, they don't want that. They want the first public showing to be them. So it's a long way of saying you get your list of 20 or 30 festivals that are like the top festivals. And those are the ones you want to submit to first. And then if you get into one of those, it's great, because then it opens up a whole world of other festivals are going to come and ask for your film. And there's a lot of prestige to say our film premiered at Sundance or Slam Dance or any of those, Tribeca, but if that doesn't happen, then you hit that second tier of great festivals. And then if that doesn't happen, you just get it out there anywhere you can. The great thing for filmmakers today is, because everything's online now, with streaming, so more people will see someone's short, in one day on a website than might have seen Up Under the Roof, in its entire run, because of streaming. So it's a phenomenal venue to get your film shown now, online festivals and streaming festivals, and then there's also all of these channels like the Shudder channel and stuff. If you're doing a horror short, they're all looking for content. So it's a much friendlier world to filmmakers than it was back in 2006, but I would say target the best festivals, and target the festivals that you think your film will do well at. Like if you have a horror short, you might want to sort of try to target a festival that you can find out, a big festival that will be sort of supportive of that will have some prestige to it. So that's what you want to do. You always want to hit the good ones first. You don't just premiere at any festival, because there are some terrible festivals out there. There are some really bad festivals out there. One of the festivals, it wasn't our premiere, but we screened at a festival where the projector was turned down so dark, the audience, of which was my family and friends, they all came out to this. They couldn't see the movie, and the person that was handling that program didn't stop or anything. It was humiliating. And I was like, so I would never go to that festival again, because they don't care about your films. So it's a lot of stuff like that, but it's a new world out there, and it's an exciting world for young people to be able to get their work seen in such a wider way than I was able to in my day.
Yeah, and I think younger people too are probably trying to figure out how they can stand out. Different technologies come about, and people can jump on them, and then everyone uses them, and they don't be, they're not as exciting anymore. But I did see on your, basically your resume, Haunting Melissa was an app-based film you worked on, iPad app. And for someone, obviously, Soderbergh used an iPhone, or, people see those films out there, but what's the process of shooting a film on an iPad, or the film that's designed, as an iPad app?
Well, Neil Edestein, the producer, came up with this genius idea. He was way ahead of his time, way ahead of his time, because we're going back 13, 14 years. He wanted to shoot a film. It's a horror story, as a whole. And then he wanted to, and we did, turn it into chapters that would play from an app that you would download. And it was a found footage film, so there were no cuts in it. It had to look like it was all recorded on the characters' phones, so we had to design it in a way that it would look seamless. And the idea was, what it was is you could download the Haunting Melissa app, and it would send you your first chapter, which is this ghost story. And after you watch the first chapter, if you watched it a second time, it would be different. And what we did is it would branch out. So I hope I can explain this, and so it's not confusing. You'd watch let's say the Melissa character walks through a hallway, and we see a figure, in the corner. When you watched it again, it would be the same scene, but the figure would be gone. Or more probably, Melissa would walk down a hallway and there'd be nothing in a corner. You'd watch it a second time and we'd have a figure sitting there. So the idea was to give the viewer this experience where, with repeated viewings, you're going to find out that there are different elements, that are going to kind of creep you out. And the other thing we did is the chapters would come at any time of the day with these like haunting noises and things. So you'd have your iPad out, and maybe at 3 a.m. you'd start hearing these god-awful, scary sounds, because it was heralding that the chapter was there for you to see. So it was an ingenious project that Neil came up with, and it was successful enough that to do a Haunting Melissa 2. But like I said, he was so ahead of his time, and I think that if he'd done it right now, it would have been, even bigger than it was, because it was just so ahead of its time. Found footage, we try to make it an immersive project, so someone on an iPad, is almost having a window into this character's world. And that's where the found footage, having it off iPhones, it was like her talking into her iPhone a lot and turning the camera around and seeing what she's seeing in other people's iPhones. And the story was recorded from, security cameras and stuff, so that you were getting like a really realistic view into this young woman's world as she's experiencing this haunting event. It was phenomenal, and I was so blessed to be a part of it. And I'm so blessed to Neil. We went up to Canada, and the Canadian crews are awesome. They're so friendly, and it was just an amazing experience. And I think someday he'll get the credit deserved for coming up with such a thing.
Yeah, way ahead of his time, obviously. And I think for people listening that are, curious about, okay, all these cool projects you worked on, right? But going back to like post production and post production supervising, someone who entered the industry when you did, was a different story. But since you're so heavily involved in that, um, for someone out there, how does someone get into your world in the present day?
I always get asked that when I speak to film classes. Well, what you have to do is you have to start by becoming a post PA, ground level, gets people coffee and lunches and things, and but it's a great learning experience because people in post production tend to be really friendly and sort of nurturing and things. And so post PAs, if they're good, will easily get bumped up. Now, if they wanted to go down my track, the next job would be post coordinator, and that would be working with post supervisor and getting mentored basically on the job. But for any job in the film industry, you sort of have to stand out, and it's always who your contacts that determine the job that you get. And I tell all of our post PAs on day one how blessed they are to be on a New Line show or a Warner Brothers show or an Amazon show, because if you start out your career in the indie world, it's harder to jump up, to keep moving up. It's very possible with hard work and talent and stuff, but it's more of a chore to come from the low budget indie world or reality world into, A-level feature films. So if you can start out on those A-level feature films, you're gold as long as you're good, because all of your contacts are going to be people who work on big budgeted feature films for big studios, and so you need to impress them. So I always tell them you got to work hard and be able to multitask, but you have to be smart about like letting people know what you're doing, showing people that you're there and that you can handle anything. And what I've seen my entire career is crews are really good about taking young people and helping them, with their careers. If you work hard, they're very good about that thing. So, to answer your question more succinctly, you have to start out as a post PA, try to start out on a bigger budget film if you can, but you got to take whatever job you can. And then if you work hard and show your worth, like the post supervisor, when we have a job where we need a coordinator on a big budgeted project, they'll go, oh, I work with that person and he or she are phenomenal, and I think I could train them, and then you bring them along, and I've done it with a lot of young people in my career. There's a lot of them out there.
Yeah, I think people, do you think have to be in LA anymore, or do you find other areas of the country, maybe the Atlantas or Albuquerque's, are just as beneficial for someone that's like, oh man, I can't afford LA, or that's too far? What do you think about someone that's okay, let me just give it a shot in Georgia?
Yeah, I think Atlanta, that's a really good point. They have this incredible industry right now. So I think like Atlanta and North Carolina and New Mexico, like you spoke about, when you and I were starting out, it was Vancouver. Everything was shot up in Vancouver. I think all of those are great avenues to get your leg in, because there's a lot of work out there. And especially, at least for my experience right now, Atlanta is huge. They're shooting everything over in Atlanta. Like everything goes there. There's a lot of work up in Canada still, so you're right. You don't have to come to LA. It is very expensive, and you can hit those smaller markets and find work, and then make the transition. Once you have some, you can work with the crew in Atlanta, and they'll be like, "Oh, can you come back to LA?" It happens all the time if they like you. The crews are very loyal, so yeah, I think that's a great point.
And do you mean come back to LA, meaning for when they actually go to edit and post when this film's done shooting? Okay.
Mm-hmm. Not all the time, but it does happen. Like crews will work with somebody and they'll like them so much they'll be like, "Well, we're going to go back to LA for 9 months now. Can you come?" Because and it's a big ask, but I've seen it happen in visual effects. I've seen them I think on Black Adam, there were some members of the crew who had just come on in Atlanta, and they brought him back to LA because they didn't want to interrupt the flow and have to train someone new. So those smaller markets are great locations to be able to get your leg in there. It's really, really good to be able to do that.
Yeah, I have a lot of friends that relocated to Atlanta in recent years, and it's for them. They're doing well, and they like the cost of living's lower too. So I think that that's a draw for a lot of people, and hopefully the cost of living doesn't start to shoot up like it is here in LA and sort of backfire on the plan of making more but spending less where you live. But for people who want to learn more about you specifically, where can someone listening to this podcast follow or connect with you online?
We have our Up Under the Roof site, which is just about the film, but there's a tiny bit of information on there about the people that worked on the film and such. But I'm Facebook, Twitter. I'm on Instagram, and I've never posted a single photo. I have to change that. But I do all of that social media stuff because it keeps me in the loop. I like to see what the new trends are. I've never gone on TikTok. But I don't think it's for someone my age anyways. So yeah, all those social media sites.
Yeah, a lot of people are on that site that you would really be surprised. So it's kind of blown up from just people shooting videos, lip syncing and all. But yeah, so listen, Darin, I appreciate your time and getting this podcast together, learning about your story. I knew about you, but I felt your story was really cool. I've known you for so long and wanted just for your story to be heard to other people, because I think people can learn a lot from all the different risks you took in your life, all the things you went after, and what you have to show for it. So thanks for taking the time today to talk with me and share that story with everyone.
Well, it was a real pleasure, and I'd do anything for you, my friend. But I think what you're doing is so important because it gets information out there to people, and it gives them direction and hope, and shows them that they can achieve their dreams. And if there's anything my career has shown, if I can do it, anybody can do it. Because we've all had all the setbacks and things, but you can achieve your dreams and you can make things happen. And so I'm really glad that you're doing this podcast to give people these different perspectives, so that it gives them more information to achieve what they're looking to do.
Yeah, I appreciate that. And again, thank you so much for your time. And, let's catch up soon. And everyone, check out Darin. I will leave links in the show notes that you can follow him. And, thanks again, Darin. I really did appreciate your time.
Thank you so much, my friend.
Thank you for taking the time to listen to this episode of Experience Curve. Please take the time to share this podcast with a friend or colleague to help get the word out about my show.